Every man on a Viking longship found the chest he rode from. It held his weapons, his food, his spare clothes, and at night, it was his bed. The ship itself was built for reach, not comfort. A typical vessel, a longship, ran 20 to 30 meters from stem to stern and barely 5 meters across at its widest. Long, narrow, low to the water, its draft was less than a meter. This meant it could be driven directly onto a beach, hauled ashore by its own crew, and relaunch when the tide allowed. No harbour required. The same shallow draft let it slip up rivers too narrow and too shallow for any other vessel of its size, following trade routes and raiding paths that simply did not exist for heavier-hulled ships. At its centre stood a single square sail, striped in contrasting colours, rigged from a mast that could be raised or lowered as the conditions required. On open water with a good wind, the sail drove everything. The oars were for when the wind forgot. The crew were not slaves at the oar. Most were free men, farmers, traders, and warriors, with a shared stake in the outcome of the voyage. Each of them had agreed to go. Each of them had packed his own chest. Before any voyage, the chests went in first. Inside each one provisions for weeks at sea, a spare set of clothes, a blanket of heavy wool, and whatever a man owned that was worth keeping dry. The width of each chest determined the spacing of the oar ports beside it. The geometry of the ship grew outward from the dimensions of a man's personal storage. The Norse were, above all things, practical. Departure was quick. The hull was pushed into the water, rowed clear of the shallows. The mast was stepped, the sail raised. No particular ceremony. Just the business of getting out to where the wind was. Beyond the shallows, the sea had its own terms. The ship had entered them, and the ship was all there was. On open water with a fair wind, a Viking longship made 5 to 8 knots. From the western coast of Norway to Lindisfarne, the Northumbrian monastery the Norse raided in 793, was 3 or 4 days. Iceland was 7 to 10. When the wind howled and the sail was drawing, the oarsmen sat on their chests and did nothing in particular. They ate, they talked, some slept. A longship crew in fair weather was not particularly miserable, which made the other conditions easier to forget, until they arrived. When the wind died, the oars went out. Each man slid his oar through the port beside him, settled his weight onto his chest, and began to pull. The same motion, hour after hour. Not fast, sustained. The crew rowed in watches, rotating shifts so that no group was worked to exhaustion before the wind returned. When a man's watch ended, he lay back on his chest and slept. Right where he sat, because there was nowhere else. At the stern, the steersman worked the steering oar. He was the most experienced hand aboard, not the most senior by rank, but the man who knew the sea best. He chose the course. Everyone else held it. Norse navigation required no compass and carried no chart. The sun compass, a flat disc with a shadow pin at its center, tracked the angle of the sun across the day, giving the steersman a bearing he could hold through the watch. When the sky clouded over, some navigators reached for the solar stein, the sunstone, a piece of Iceland spar, a type of calcite crystal held to an overcast sky and rotated slowly, reveals the sun's position through the polarization of light, even when the sky shows nothing but grey. The sagas describe its use. Modern scientists have confirmed that it works. Whether every crew carried one is uncertain. But those that did had a meaningful edge in the conditions the North Atlantic specializes in. Beyond instruments, the steersman read the world itself. Seabirds meant land was within range. The color of the water changed over shallows and over deep ocean. The pattern of the Atlantic swell, running in consistent directions from consistent causes, gave a bearing that required no instrument to read, only experience. The steersman also carried coastlines in his head. The exact shape of a headland at dawn. The silhouette of a particular mountain seen from a known distance offshore. This knowledge was not written down. It passed between sailors by word and repetition, tested over years against the sea itself. Navigation was the steersman's problem. The rest of life aboard was everyone's. There was no fire at sea. A fire aboard an open wooden hull on the North Atlantic is not a solution to any problem anyone would willingly create. Every meal on a Viking voyage was cold. The centerpiece of the diet was stockfish, cod or similar, dried until it had the approximate consistency of wood. Before it could be eaten, it had to be beaten with a mallet until soft enough to chew. It tasted of salt and old sea and months in a storage chest. It kept for months. This was the point, alongside the stockfish salted pork, flatbread baked hard before departure, and mysa. Mysa was the sour fermented whey left from cheese making, acidic enough to preserve well and thin enough to drink. It also stretched the water supply, which mattered considerably. Water itself was carried in barrels and strictly rationed. A miscalculation in provisioning could kill a crew more reliably than any storm, and this was understood clearly, and the barrels were watched. At night, the sail became a shelter. Unrigged from the mast and draped over the boom and the upright walls, it formed a low tent that ran the length of the hull. Beneath it, men wrapped in wool and fur slept on their sea chests. The ocean moved less than a meter below the hull planking on either side. It was cold. The North Atlantic at night, even in the sailing season, does not accommodate a preference for warmth. Norse sailors understood cold not as a problem to solve, but as a condition to endure, which is a different relationship with it entirely. The question of sanitation had a direct and unapologetic answer. There was no toilet. When a man needed to relieve himself, he went to the gunwale, took hold of a rope, and leaned out over the water. In calm conditions, this was unremarkable. In heavy weather, it required a certain indifference to dignity and a firm grip. In truly rough seas, it was not merely undignified. It was dangerous. The sea had no particular interest in the schedule of 60 men. Illness was a persistent threat. Close quarters, constant cold and damp, and weeks of preserved food created conditions in which sickness spread quickly and was difficult to manage. The sagas are largely quiet on this. The burial customs are not. If a man died at sea, the crew gave him a sea burial. His body was wrapped in cloth. His weapons were laid alongside him. His sea chest was inventoried in front of witnesses before anything was touched. Every item counted and noted. When the ship reached land, its contents were returned to his family. The cosmological difficulty with dying at sea was that it interrupted the ordinary routes of the Norse dead. Those killed in battle went to Valhalla, or to Freyja's Hall Folkvanger. Those who died of illness went to Hell. But those taken by the sea went to Ran. Ran was the goddess of the sea, wife of Idea, ruler of the deep. She gathered the drowned in her net and carried them down to her hole beneath the water. It was not Valhalla, but she was said to receive kindly those who came to her with gold. For this reason, some sailors carried a small piece of gold when they put to sea. Not for trade, for Ran. An advance payment, offered against the reasonable possibility that the sea might collect on its own account before the voyage was through. The sea, for its part, made no promises. Norse sailors were skilled, among the most capable open water navigators in the medieval world. But skill and the North Atlantic are not in an equal negotiation. Ships were lost. Voyages were abandoned and re-attempted the following season. Storms built quickly. A good crew read the sky early enough to take in sail and run before it, or to bring the hull around and ride the waves head-on. What they could not do was stop it. Fog was in some ways harder than a storm. A storm could be survived and eventually waited out. Fog erased the horizon, the sun, the stars, every navigational reference, and left 60 men somewhere in the North Atlantic with their best guess and the steering oar. And then, eventually, the coast would appear. Not all at once. First as a thickening at the edge of the sea haze, a darkness that was not clouds. Then as a shape, then as cliffs and headlands. And before the coast was fully visible, the smell. Land on the wind has a particular character that open ocean does not. The crew knew it. The sail came down. The mast was lowered into the hull. The oars went out for the final approach, slow and deliberate, reading the water ahead for rocks and sandbars and the right line into shore. Then the hull ground onto gravel. Men dropped into cold, shallow water and waded the last few meters to the beach. Some dragged the bow line. Some simply walked forward on legs that had forgotten what solid ground felt like. The ship that had seemed impossibly small for 3 weeks, that narrow, wet, open hull, had been, in the end, enough. Not comfortable. Not easy. Enough.